It's always terrific to be here with the Farmington Historical Society, especially when the conversation centers on Thomas Jefferson. And today is especially wonderful because, as Jefferson said, spring makes a paradise of our country, so that we are lucky to be here. I'm always delighted by the amazing programs that Punky and Melissa put together. They're really fun. And to borrow Jefferson's granddaughter Ellen's description of Monticello, bravo for these feasts of reason. They are very enriching to us. Tonight we are treated not to one, but to two Jeffersons. Dr. J. Jefferson Looney is the Daniel P. Jordan editor of the Papers of Thomas Jefferson at Monticello, referred to hereafter as Jeff, familiarly. We should credit Jeff's parents with charting the course of his destiny, and maybe he will tell us how he came to be called Jefferson. But I don't know the backstory, but thank goodness for us that they settled on the right founder. He could have been Madison, and then we might not know him. Jefferson occupies a chair for the Monticello leader who initiated this tremendously important endeavor now in its 25th year. Jeff is the founding editor-in-chief of the Jefferson Papers Retirement Series, sponsored by Monticello, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. 19 volumes of this definitive edition of Jefferson's writings and correspondence between 1809 and 1826 have been published, and 2 more are in press. And they are on time. It is exactly the schedule that Jeff predicted in 1999, and it is an awesome achievement to have done something so well and in such a timely fashion. We are all indebted to him. Jeff and his colleagues fastidiously transcribe Jefferson's letters and provide informed annotations. He and his colleagues thus have an exacting knowledge of Jefferson and his correspondence. Access to this material in archives across the world, there are some 400 different collections that contain Jefferson materials, has literally transformed Jefferson scholarship. I cannot praise the impact or describe the impact enough, because all of the materials are now thankfully digitally accessible and democratically available to all. You can go home tonight and access Jefferson's papers, his exact words. It's pretty remarkable. And I encourage you to do so, and also to, if you aren't comfortable reading online, buy a volume, or in fact, the entire series. Before coming to Monticello, Jeff was formerly the editor and project director of the Dictionary of Virginia Biography, and he's a past president of the Association for Documentary Editing. He's the author or editor of several works on the history of Princeton University, where he did his doctoral work in British history. Explain that to us, Jeff. At Monticello, where I am proud to be his colleague, Jeff is known for his kind and gentle manner, his erudition, and his dazzling collection of patriotic ties. Tonight, Jeff will discuss the bicentennial of Lafayette's triumphal American tour, when the last surviving Revolutionary War journal visited every American state and inspired massive patriotic celebrations wherever he went, from New York and Boston to Mobile, Alabama. Jeff is also going to tell us about the Papers Project, share insights into the friendship between Jefferson and Lafayette from their correspondence, and describe their touching reunion at Monticello, which could bring tears to your eyes, as well as the formal ceremonies and dinner with which our Albemarle community greeted Lafayette. And his remarks, Punky, beautifully set the stage for our April program. So it is my honor and privilege to welcome Jeff Looney.
I have one piece of brand new news to update something Susan said, which is that within the last several weeks, we have moved up to volume 20. So I brandish it with pleasure. So thank you, Susan, for that generous introduction and for the invitation to speak at a place with so many close Jefferson associations. My mentor at Monticello, Dan Jordan, used to say that one should always give bad news first. And so I will begin my depiction of Lafayette's visit to Albemarle in 1824 by admitting that, despite examination of every available contemporary account, I have found no evidence that the general made his way to Farmington during his visit. And while it's hard to prove a negative, much of the visit was exhaustively documented, as you will see, and so Lafayette was quite likely just too overbooked to get here. On the other hand, while I cannot place George Divers or his lady at the public festivities at the University of Virginia, it is much easier to speculate that he was among the throng welcoming Lafayette to Albemarle. Let me start by talking a bit more about the Papers of Thomas Jefferson and Jefferson's earlier connections to Lafayette, and then move on to the celebrated visit in November 1824. Our project began in 1943 as one effort to commemorate the bicentennial of Jefferson's birth. The ambitious goal was, and is, creation of the definitive edition of the third president's papers. There had been 4 earlier collected editions of Jefferson's writings, but they had all proved inadequate in various ways. We intend to do the work so well that this time that there will be no need for a 6th version in the future. The first editor, Julian Boyd, was a pioneer of this sort of work, and he articulated 2 principles that were new at the time and that, like most revolutionary ideas, now seem obvious in retrospect and are widely used. The first was to include incoming letters as well as those by Jefferson, because you can't really understand his letters if you don't have the letters to which he is responding. And you even need to include those he didn't answer so that you can tell what he thought was worthy of a response. Non-epistolary documents, ranging from receipts and accounts to state papers like his inaugural addresses, and enclosures to letters that Jefferson was sent, are also included. As Boyd said, the goal is to deal with, quote, everything legitimately Jeffersonian by reason of authorship or of relationship. Boyd's other new idea was to track down all known texts of every document. Previous efforts of this kind were based on large archives of material retained by the subject, such as those made on Jefferson's renowned polygraph machine. This wasn't good enough for us, because the version that went out the door might have been revised or had a postscript added. Admittedly, locating all this material required conducting an ongoing worldwide search that has brought in copies of documents from more than 1,000, actually, repositories over the years, worldwide, ranging from the huge collection at the Library of Congress to a single letter owned by a private collector. I'll give one example of why this effort matters. In 1815, a man named Peter Wendover sent Jefferson a book that interested Jefferson so much that he responded with a long letter expressing his own belief that clergy should not discuss political issues in their sermons. Jefferson thought that this was a breach of contract. Ministers were entitled to their own political views, of course, but they were hired to preach religion, and in the pulpit, he thought that they should stick to that. But then, Having written the letter, Jefferson realized that his position was controversial, to say the least, in that time, and he wanted to keep his retirement quiet. He added a note saying that, after all, he didn't know Wendover and couldn't rely on his discretion, and he substituted a much shorter note saying, in effect, "Sir, thanks for the book. Sincerely, Tom." Our full search for documents enables us to include both the draft and the final version, as we did in this case. Our team of editors applies the same rigor to our transcriptions, checking each letter multiple times, word for word and character for character. Our goal is to present the text so accurately that future readers will not need to go back to the original manuscript. We therefore preserve original spelling and punctuation and are thus able to show that Jefferson did everything for a reason. In an era when spelling was still fluid, to say the least, he sought to model a more rational orthography. For example, he had no patience with the I before E except after C rule and standardized everything in his writing as EI. He tried to eliminate unnecessary letters, consistently spelling knowledge without the W or the D. Made it shorter, made more sense to him. And he saw no point in making it's the only possessive without an apostrophe. So he added it there. And I might add that means that doing this kind of work means your spelling goes to hell. Because I have to stop every time I'm writing something and think, am I using Jefferson's spelling or my own? Even small details can be revealing. Jefferson begins most of his letters with either "Sir" or "Dear Sir." And the choice matters. You don't get to be a "Dear Sir" unless you're someone that Jefferson has actually met. And you can even be demoted. When one "Dear Sir" makes a proposal that Jefferson finds unacceptable, his letter to the next man is addressed to just plain "Sir." Finally, we include annotation that provides necessary context, providing brief biographies of correspondence, defining obscure words, translating foreign language material, identifying literary allusions, supplying dates for undated documents, and correcting factual errors, as when Jefferson misaddresses a letter. We provide such commentary, however, without adding interpretation that would only become dated going forward. Such restraint is necessary because, as we like to say and believe, most of our readers have not yet been born. Experience has shown again and again that this careful and meticulous work is essential, and the Jefferson Papers is widely regarded as one of the flagship documentary editing projects. However, it is very time-consuming, and after more than half a century, in 1999, the papers still had not gotten Jefferson to the vice presidency. At that point, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation in Monticello got involved, asking what could be done to get the project completed in someone's foreseeable lifetime. They worked out a deal, and by they I mainly mean Dan Jordan. They worked out a deal with Princeton University, which had sponsored and housed the project from the beginning, according to which work would continue there on the years up to and through Jefferson's presidency, but a new project covering the retirement years, 1809 to 1826, would be created at Monticello. In effect, the project was cloned so that volumes could come out twice as fast without impairing quality. The rest is history, as we like to say. The papers in Princeton are now well into Jefferson's second term as president, and meanwhile, we have published 20 retirement volumes, 1809 to 1824, with only 4 more to go at our end. The total papers edition will run to something like 80 volumes, and completion is now foreseeable. This speeding up of the work is wonderful on many levels, but it is especially so for anyone interested in Jefferson and Monticello, because his final retirement represents the longest and best documented period that he lived on his beloved little mountain, interrupted only by intermittent visits to his equally cherished refuge at Poplar Forest. If the new series had not been created in 1999, everything after 1805 would still be largely inaccessible to most scholars, including Jefferson's Herculean efforts to plan and open the University of Virginia, his role in transforming the Library of Congress into a broad cultural institution after the British burned its predecessor in 1814, and, not least for our purposes, the visits of Lafayette. So that's what we do and why it matters. I could give you more examples, and I'll gladly do so if there is time for questions later, but for now, we should turn to the friendship that brought an aging French veteran to Monticello in the autumn of 1824. Thomas Jefferson's decades-long association with Lafayette began on 29 April 1781. Jefferson was well into his difficult tenure, to say the least, as wartime governor of Virginia when the youthful Major General marched his troops into Richmond just in time to prevent its occupation by a British army for the second time that year. Obviously, a meeting under those circumstances would have recommended the young Frenchman to Jefferson, and the two hit it off well, as Jefferson continued his efforts to supply and support the Continental Army. But their friendship really solidified during Jefferson's years as American minister to France. Lafayette proved to be his most faithful and useful ally in Paris, providing introductions into court circles, advice on strategy and lobbying tactics, and unwavering support as Jefferson tried to negotiate commercial treaties and strengthen the fledgling nation's commercial ties and its standing in the Old World. In his turn, Jefferson counseled Lafayette and his circle of friends as they pushed for liberal reforms in the run-up to the French Revolution, most notably when they met at Jefferson's house in 1789 to draft the celebrated Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Later that year, Jefferson returned to America. He did not see Lafayette again for 35 years, but he closely monitored his friend's career as a continuing leader in the cause of moderate French constitutional reform, which certainly had its high and low points. The lowest was surely 1792, when Lafayette, now a general in the French Revolutionary Army, but in imminent danger of arrest and execution for opposing the Jacobins, fled across enemy lines and soon found himself in what became 5 difficult years of captivity in Prussian and Austrian prisons. As Secretary of State, Jefferson anxiously conferred with President George Washington on what could be done to help their old comrade. No formal demand for his release could be made without endangering American neutrality, but Jefferson thought of a loophole to help him. During the American Revolution, Lafayette had refused any salary for his service in the Continental Army, but it was now decided that this could be paid to him after the fact, with interest, and this certainly eased his circumstances during this difficult time. After his release, Lafayette and Jefferson resumed an intermittent but friendly and supportive correspondence, and as president, Jefferson made sure that a land grant to which Lafayette was entitled for his military service should be located on prime real estate near New Orleans after the Louisiana Purchase. At this time, the cause of liberal reform in France also had its ups and downs, mostly downs, and in 1823, Lafayette lost his bid for a re-election to the Chamber of Deputies. When word reached America that the discouraged general was considering a transatlantic visit, Congress passed a resolution urging the president to extend him a formal invitation, and James Monroe readily complied. Lafayette arrived in New York City in September. From New York, he went to Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, Mount Vernon, and Yorktown before proceeding to Monticello. He was met everywhere with pomp and acclaim, and I want to use my remaining time by taking a deep dive into Lafayette's visit to Albemarle County as a good example. The general arrived at the county line at 11 a.m. on 4 November 1824. He was escorted to the border by the Fluvanna County Militia and its Committee of Arrangements. There he was met and, as it were, handed off to the corresponding Albemarle Committee of Arrangements. On one side of the road, the Albemarle Lafayette Guards, a volunteer troop of cavalry created for the occasion, awaited him, with a large body of citizens on the other side. The troops formed a hollow square with Lafayette in the middle, and the chair of the committee, William Cabell Reeves, gave an address of welcome. Lafayette responded with a speech of his own, and there were cheers. After refreshments in Boyd's Tavern, at noon, 3 carriages with Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson's landau, which had been sent for the purpose, departed for Monticello. Around 2 p.m., the procession reached Monticello, where another large group of spectators had been waiting for hours to witness the much-anticipated reunion. Again, 2 lines were formed, at the circular yard in front of the house, with the cavalry escort on one side and the citizens on the other. According to a newspaper account, as soon as the general drove up, Mr. Jefferson advanced to meet him with feeble steps, but as he approached, his feelings seemed to triumph over the infirmities of age, and as the general descended, they hastened into each other's arms. They embraced again and again. Tears were shed by both, and the broken expressions of, "God bless you, General," "Bless you, my dear Jefferson," was all that interrupted the impressive silence of the scene, except the audible sobs of many whose emotion could not be suppressed. End quote. In addition to the adults, a group of, junior volunteers had gathered to greet Lafayette, and after he had entered Monticello for a few minutes, he came back out and listened with evident delight to another address of welcome by their leader, one Egbert Watson, and answered it with a, very warm and affectionate reply. Eventually, most of the audience departed, and Lafayette and his suite had dinner at Monticello, which became his headquarters for the remainder of his 11-day stay. At 10 a.m. the next day, 5 November, the Deputation Committee and the Lafayette Guards were waiting to escort the general to Charlottesville. Lafayette and James Madison, who had arrived the previous evening, joined Jefferson in his landau, and they were off, followed by a crowd of citizens. When they arrived at the Central Hotel, hundreds more were waiting there. The chairman of the committee, Jefferson's grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, gave a speech of welcome, to which Lafayette replied. They then proceeded into the hotel, in a room prepared for their reception, and the general was introduced to all who desired it. The crowd was great. There seemed but one feeling in the living mass, to see, to hear, to touch him. The general wore a pleased and smiling countenance. End quote. Apparently, there was no downtime for Lafayette, because at noon, the procession for the trip to the university formed up. The newspaper was careful to give the order in which they came. Chief Marshal with 2 aides, President of the day, the General, Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Madison, in a landau drawn by 4 gray horses, General's son and suite, carriage with 2 cream-colored horses, visitors of the University of Virginia in a carriage, standing committee, magistrates, cavalry, junior volunteers, citizens on horseback, citizens on foot. The newspaper adds that the procession moved slowly to the university. I'll bet. And emphasizes that nothing could have been, more orderly performed. Each man, from the accuracy of his movements, seemed to have been drilled to his duty, and that throughout the day, the arrangements were never broken. There was no ebullition of the passions, no violation of decorum. It was the decorum of respect. Then, as the university came suddenly into view, 1,000 of the daughters of the mountains, ranged aloft on the terraces, waved their white kerchiefs in the air. At the steps of the rotunda, William Fitzhugh Gordon gave Lafayette a speech of welcome, to which Lafayette replied appropriately. They then gave Lafayette a few minutes of rest in rooms prepared for him, but soon, he walked on the terraces among the ladies, to many of whom he was introduced, and with whom he shook hands in the most courteous and graceful manner. The big event of the day came at 3 p.m., with dinner in the dome room of the rotunda, which was set up for the purpose, even though Construction of the building was not yet complete. The room was packed with reportedly 400 guests. There were 3 concentric circles of tables. Lafayette was placed under an arch of living laurel with Jefferson and Madison on his right hand. After the dinner, there were toasts. A lot of toasts. To start with, there were 13 numbered toasts, presumably a figure chosen to match the original number of states. Following well-established conventions at this time for public dinners like this, these toasts would have been planned well in advance, and they thus include such obvious crowd pleasers as toasts to Lafayette, George Washington, the American Revolution, and the ladies of America. Toast number 6 was to, quote, Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, alike identified with the cause of liberty. Jefferson immediately responded with a written speech, which he, knowing his limitations as a public speaker, had someone else read for him. This address also complimented Lafayette, who was, quote, moved to tears. He grasped the hand of his venerable friend who penned it and sobbed aloud. Toast 7 praised Madison, who also responded with a speech. Even with 13 toasts, they were just getting started. Again, following the conventions for this sort of gathering, the numbered ones were followed by, quote, volunteer toasts, offered up more or less spontaneously by the attendees. There were no fewer than 34 of these volunteer toasts. As might be expected, many of them directly or indirectly, and sometimes redundantly, complimented Lafayette, often with flowery allusions, as with the toast of A.G. Monroe to, quote, General Lafayette, his reception in America, the cradle that rocked the youthful Hercules, shivers the dogma that republics are ungrateful, and at the very worst epoch for the machinations of tyrants. The toast could stray into contemporary politics, as with that of William Woods to, quote, the next legislature of Virginia, unlike its predecessors, may it expend less treasure in useless legislation and more for the cause of literature and reward of patriotism and valor. This little dig referring to complaints that the state ought to do more for both the university and for Lafayette. And some of the toasts show off biblical or classical knowledge in ways that may have seemed obscure to at least some of those in attendance, as they certainly do to us, as when Jefferson's nephew, Samuel Carr, expressed the hope that, quote, may the friends of liberty, like the pyramids of Egypt, be strengthened by time, and her enemies, like Jonah's gourd, wither in a night. I can explain that one if you ask later, but I had to look it up. Taken as a whole, we are talking about almost 50 toasts in a banquet that lasted 3 hours. Even those who were used to this sort of thing must have been exhausted when the gathering ended. And unless they monitored their intake very carefully, some of the departing guests must have been quite tipsy. At last, Lafayette, Madison, and Jefferson bundled back into that landau and returned to Monticello, escorted by the usual 100 troops. Now, so far I've relied almost entirely on the very full newspaper account, but I can intervene here with another plug for what we do at the Jefferson Papers. When we began the retirement series, we decided to expand our scope a bit. While it was and remains true that our primary focus is letters by and to Thomas Jefferson, we realized that, especially in his last years, there is a very rich body of material about him in letters by family members describing Grandpapa's conversations and opinions, and in similar accounts by the visitors who flocked to Monticello for a look at the aging statesman. In the case of Lafayette's visit, we have tracked down more than a dozen of these third-party accounts, and we will be printing many of them when we cover the visit in volume 22. These documents flesh out the story in all sorts of interesting ways. We learn that the young members of the junior volunteers had drilled for their appearance before reaching Monticello, that they were, quote, armed with sharp-pointed sticks tipped with pikes, and that Hezekiah Reeder, an adult with years of experience teaching military drill, commanded the boys. From a memoir by Thomas Jefferson Randolph, we know that the ceremony of welcome at the Albemarle County line was nearly an embarrassing failure. A scout had been sent up the road to give timely warning when Lafayette's carriage approached, but it came on so fast that it arrived on the heels of the scout himself, taking everyone waiting by surprise. Fortunately, the welcoming unit was in place practicing for his arrival and able to snap to attention when, quote, "we were all brought suddenly to order," and with, quote, "Mr. Reeves promptly and handsomely collecting himself for the address of welcome, Lafayette was probably none the wiser." From the same source, we know that after their tearful first reunion in Monticello, the large crowd was invited into the house, but no one would enter, and they, quote, "dispersed without the slightest noise." The newspaper account says nothing of the dinner at Monticello that same night, but we know from the other descriptions that the 20 or so who sat down to table consisted of Lafayette, his son George Washington de Lafayette, and his secretary, Madison, who arrived just in time for dessert, and Jefferson and his family, with so many female granddaughters and cousins that, quote, "one side of the table showed an almost unbroken line of beautiful young girls." One of them recalled much later noticing that, quote, the French hero ate fish not only with his fingers, but with his whole hand dipped into the mess Arab fashion. Probably won't want to repeat that next month. Memoirs by two men enslaved at Monticello recall the visit. This is how we know that the slaves were given a holiday on the day of the procession to and banquet at the University of Virginia. Particularly significant is the recollection by Israel Gillette, who later added Jefferson to his surname, that during a carriage ride, he overheard Lafayette discussing slavery with Jefferson. Quote, "Lafayette thought that the slaves ought to be free, that no man could rightfully hold ownership in his brother man, that he gave his best services to and spent his money in behalf of the Americans freely, because he felt that they were fighting for a great and noble principle, the freedom of mankind, that instead of all being free, a portion were held in bondage, which seemed to grieve his noble heart, and that it would be mutually beneficial to masters and slaves if the latter were educated." End quote. Jefferson agreed in principle to ending slavery, but thought that the time was not yet ripe, a frequent refrain in his later writings, and he felt that slaves should be taught to read but not to write, since the latter skill would make it more difficult to keep them in bondage. Despite this disappointingly equivocal reaction by Jefferson, Lafayette's appeal may have affected him at least briefly. The author, Fanny Wright, had been traveling with Lafayette and joined him at Monticello partway through his stay, and she observed that Jefferson was, quote, "very anxious that some steps which he considers as preparatory to the abolition of slavery, at least in this state, should be adopted this winter. But if Jefferson did anything himself to advance this cause at this time, there is no record of it." Now, from this wallowing in the sources, you will have seen that we know a great deal about those few days that Lafayette spent in Albemarle County. It may seem a bit much, and indeed, you may agree with one observer who wryly remarked to a friend, quote, "You have no doubt heard enough of the nation's guest to say, 'Lord, suffer thy servant to be at rest as regards this thing.' But this story has a more general application and a general conclusion. The hoopla over Lafayette's time in Charlottesville, complete with speech after speech, endless toasts, and introductions to hundreds of excited citizens, military escorts, and triumphal processions, was completely typical. When he left Monticello, he was escorted by the same group of volunteers to the Orange County line, where a new committee and militia unit welcomed him with speeches and escorted him to Montpelier to be Madison's guest and proceed to another dinner in his honor. Lafayette's tour was originally intended to take up 4 months, but wound up lasting for 16 and included all 24 states then in the Union. Even with the occasional break, such as the latter part of his stay at Monticello, all this fuss must have been exhausting. More than one person at the time marveled at the stamina of the 67-year-old veteran and wondered if he could keep it up. William Short, who had been with Jefferson in Paris and knew Lafayette well, expressed the hope just before the general reached Monticello that there he might, quote, have some repose, of which indeed he must have great need. Indeed, I cannot conceive how he has been able to survive the campaign of bustle, confusion, and excitement through which he has gone. To him, on the contrary, to Lafayette, on the contrary, it seems to give new life and vigor. But this is 4 months into the 16 months. End quote. And keep it up Lafayette did for a full year longer, as evidenced by the many historical markers and the towns, counties, and youth schools bearing his name that track his progress around the nation. We can hearken back to Jefferson's time in Paris. In a letter written to James Madison on 30 January 1787, partly in code so that he could safely comment on individuals, Jefferson praised Lafayette as, quote, a most valuable auxiliary to me, commending his zeal in helping American interests, his, quote, good sense and, quote, sound genius, and growing popularity, except among those who disliked his Republican principles. Jefferson concluded that Lafayette's, quote, only foible is a canine appetite for popularity and fame. But he will get above this. Evidently, Lafayette never did. But at a time when citizens were already worrying about these sectional and ideological rivalries that were dividing the nation and creating forebodings of the crisis to come, Lafayette's triumphal tour did much to foster pride and national unity and was fondly remembered for decades. It is a pleasure to recall it in the bicentennial year of his arrival. Thank you.